geoengineering, and therefore this kind of panel and the kind of questions about governance are critically important, because in the absence of that information, we're going to continue to see the kinds of confusion, and frankly, I don't think the information itself is going to create more calls for the use of geoengineering. If anything, I think the absence of information about the risks and the absence of information about the possible ramifications of putting sulfur particles in the sky or solar mirrors, I think the absence of that information is what allows the calls for geoengineering to persist. And so people talk about moral hazard, and they talk about concerns which I think are real, that if we do more research, perhaps that will take attention and motivation away from abatement efforts. I understand those concerns and I share them, but I think if we ignore geoengineering, or we say we're not going to talk about it, or we don't do any research into it, we'll exacerbate those concerns rather than address them. So I think the most important thing going forward is we need more information. We need research into this. What kind of research and how do we govern that are the questions we need to ask, and that's obviously the focus of this panel. I think it's useful then, moving into governance, to distinguish, as Michael Oppenheimer and some of his colleagues have, between, and I think as Jason did in his presentation, between research into, sort of modeling research, computer modeling research that you might say is sort of low impact research, right? I think that's very important to do, and that should be going on, and that raises obviously limited risks. The main one would be moral hazard, and that's what I just addressed. But clearly, before you get into anything that's sort of engineering or climatic scale, we need the governance issues. We need to address those governance issues, and I would see them as kind of a layer of approaches. Clearly, norms and principles will be very important, and those are going to have to come out from, I think, a discussion within the scientific community aided by civil society, and a good analogy there might be the bioethics debate in the 1970s, where there was progress towards establishing norms and principles about DNA research before that, largely before the research really took off. And having that done before the research really expands is crucial. I think there's also got to be another layer, which might be a sort of review and coordination of research, and this is probably best done by some sort of international body, maybe affiliated with the UN, maybe not, but some sort of international review, international geoengineering coordination and review board. This is also one of the suggestions by Oppenheimer and others. And then I think the final layer is to start to think about not just the regulation of research, but also what an international regime, or what levers we might have from an international perspective in terms of deployment of geoengineering. And so some folks like Scott Barrett in the political science and political economy literature have pointed out this is a problem. The collective action problem here is almost the reverse of the collective action problem being faced in the Bella Center. This is that it's very low cost for any individual actor to act. There might be potentially some large benefits for some actors who are particularly threatened, and so what we have to worry about is how to constrain that deployment rather than to engage in collective action. So perhaps we can also look ahead and think about that kind of international regime for deployment.
Okay, thanks for that, Nathaniel. Richard Klein from the Stockholm Environment Institute.
Yes, thank you, Robin, and thanks also for inviting me to be on the panel at the last minute. On the issue of governance, Jason and I started talking about it when I was introduced to him as a Unfccc nerd, somebody who knows all the various processes and so on, and not an awful lot about geoengineering, I have to admit. And the first question Jason had to me is how would one actually put an issue like geoengineering on the agenda of the negotiations? And my view is that, well, that's actually going to be very difficult. The UNFCCC talks about adaptation and mitigation as the two strategies. Geoengineering really isn't either, although carbon dioxide removal to some extent can be seen as a form of mitigation, at least at small scale, but certainly solar radiation management isn't either. And the process of putting things on the agenda, well, at the moment, things still need to be decided by consensus. So if one party were to propose putting geoengineering on the agenda of the negotiations, I'm sure there'll be plenty of parties who would disagree with that for the various moral hazard risks that they expect. And so this would be an agenda item to be held in abeyance for a long time. Having said that, the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report outline contains a reference to geoengineering in various places. So it may well be possible that once the fifth assessment report comes out in 2013, 2014, that the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, SubStar, will discuss the issue in its discussion of the IPCC findings and make it possible, at least for the UNFCCC, to start a debate on this. On the other hand, why the UNFCCC? Well, it is of course about climate and it's about reducing climate risks. But it's in fact the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, that has called for a moratorium on ocean experiments, for example. And I think that raises the issue that there isn't one single governance system that would be able to control or regulate the whole issue of geoengineering and the various aspects of it. But anyway, going back to the UNFCCC, both John and Jason raised the issue of equity, and one phrase that always comes back in the negotiation is that of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And, well, we know what that means in terms of mitigation efforts and the need for financial and technological transfer. In the case of geoengineering, well, if indeed this is relatively affordable, even for small island states that might be tempted to use geoengineering to continue their existence, then that raises many different ethical considerations and equity considerations. The fact that there has been an international hearing between the UK and the US is of course a good start, but given that this is indeed a global issue, when will developing countries be part of such international hearings, and indeed who will take the initiative to do that? Then on the issue of research, the reason I started sort of looking into the issue of geoengineering from a research point of view is that my background is in adaptation. I worked on adaptation to climate change, 15 years ago, when it was still very much a taboo subject. I can tell you various stories of how people tried to stop me from getting research funding, for example, because adaptation was going to distract from mitigation. Same story that we are having now on geoengineering, although slightly different, because 15 years ago it was already clear that adaptation was going to be a necessity if climate change is indeed happening, and that has been established. Geoengineering with a good outcome in Copenhagen may still be something we don't have to use and will indeed be a theoretical construct more than something we need in practical terms. But anyway, the reason I think we need to talk also about researchers is not just the physical scientists and the engineers who set the agenda. At the moment, most of, if not all of the research on geoengineering, as reflected also in the Royal Society report, is about the biology, chemistry, and physics of it, and the technical feasibility of things. If we are to engage in a debate with other countries, with the public, talk not only about the technical feasibility but also about the social acceptability of it, about the perception of risks, then we really also need to engage the social scientists, policy analysts, legal analysts. So that's my call then for the research community and the research funders is don't focus just on the natural science of it, because it would be another type of risk to assume that they can set the policy agenda based on their expert but still relatively limited knowledge of just the physical and technical aspects of geoengineering. Thanks.
Okay, Richard, thank you. I'm Tariq Banouri from the UN Division on Sustainable Development.
Thank you. I'm Tariq Banouri from the UN, but I'm speaking in my personal capacity here. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was late. We were stuck in a meeting in the Bella Center earlier, but whatever I heard, I'm enormously educated and greatly benefit from the Royal Society report and both Jason and John's presentations and these comments. I basically want to make three fairly quick points. First is that I would like to suggest, even when the proceedings of this discussion are written up, that we think about them consciously as not as a dimension of international environmental governance, but international sustainable development governance. And I want to come back to what why I raised this issue. But one significant problem is that we have learned fairly all the way through from the 1970s, as we began to think about sustainability questions more critically, that sustainability in a world that is grossly unequal, both in terms of vulnerability and access to consumption and prosperity, but also in terms of access to knowledge and ability to communicate. In such an unequal world, movements towards sustainability would always remain very intermittent, hesitant, and tentative. And that's part of the problem that we are seeing over here. If you imagine the world which was all at the level of affluence of the United States or Europe, everybody was, all countries were pretty much at that level, it would have been much more easy to move towards a solution rather than the situation in which we find ourselves today. So keeping that in mind and also keeping the scientific and technical inequality is absolutely fundamental. That's the first point I want to make. My second point is soon after, and this is a reflection on the governance issue in particular, but also bringing back some background on this. Soon after the Limits to Growth report came out in 1972, there was a very interesting article by somebody who has basically worked in government and intelligence, William Offals, called the Scarcity Society. And what Offals argued was very interesting. His main point, if I can summarize it, is the following: that the problem that that confronts us today is that when you think seriously about a scarcity society, that means this age of unlimited growth being over, and although he doesn't use those words, but almost saying that if we live in a zero-sum world, then the options, political options, become extremely unpalatable. And he said one option that people are seeing is a kind of an authoritarian, unequal, almost a kind of a feudalist option. The other one is what he saw as a kind of a technocratic option. As you remember, in those days, in the 60s, Buckminster Fuller and Professor Bowling had introduced this notion of spaceship Earth. And he basically said, spaceships are not run by democracies, they're run by a captain with some hierarchies and so on. And so the real question is, are we going to get into a technocratic world, or are we going to get into this very feudal kind of a world? And that was a fundamental question that he posed. It is a question that we need to think about. As the panic rises about climate change, are we actually going to quickly dismantle a lot of the democratic institutions and rights and freedoms and even our respect for equality and sovereignty that we have built up very, very painstakingly over decades, if not centuries. And that is a fundamental problem. That is a problem that even the discussions that are taking place on the other side of this divide are trying to keep all of those things in place as we move towards perhaps one of the largest challenges that we face today. Now, this issue of governance, therefore, and the balance between technocratic and democratic solutions will remain a central one, and therefore anything that sort of begins to shift that balance has risks of a political nature, which in the end might end up far exceeding the risks of an environmental or purely physical nature. When I was a colleague of Richard's in the Stockholm Environment Institute, we did. Paul Raskin had led this group called the Global Scenarios Group. Some of you may be familiar with it or might have participated in it. We did the main scenarios for the Global Environmental Outlook, UNEP's publication. And one of the distinctions we were trying to make there, although we don't actually say it in this form, but one of the distinctions we were trying to make is we had these four major scenarios: the market world, the policy world, and then there's something called the Great Transition, which actually is a shift towards a society which is democratic, equitable, and sustainable. It's participatory and sustainable, as opposed to one which we call the fortress world, in which basically people build up fortresses to protect themselves. And the simplest way to think about it is that if we can continue to keep on growing, if the bonanza does not end, then a fragmented solution is the market world and an integrated solution is a policy world. If we end up in the scarcity society, a fragmented solution will lead us to a fortress world. And the question we need to ask ourselves is it something that we need to be concerned about as we embark on any particular research process? But a coherent solution, an integrated solution, a solution in which we all come together, is the kind of the great transition world. And I don't have time to go into it, but let me just make one point before I end, and that is that we do have an international governance system. If I can put it very simply, it is a system in which there is a parliament, which is some composition of the United Nations system, the General Assembly, Unfccc, etc. And then the executives are the countries. Imagine that if the United States, Jefferson and Hamilton had an argument and Jefferson had won out, and all the executive power was in the states, and the federal government only made laws, had no power to execute them. That's the kind of the system. And that is deliberate because it is a situation in which there's a tremendous deficit of trust between the rich and the poor. Even when people say this is going to impact the poor countries more than the others, the poor countries treat it with suspicion because they think they're saying it in order to make us do something which might not be in our interest. There's a huge deficit of deficit of trust. Therefore, this consensus-based decision-making has become central. If it is replaced with some other form of more, aggressive decision-making, in this situation of distrust, it can actually backfire because it can deepen the divide rather than make it easier for us to handle these things. I'm going to leave it there. I have some other thoughts, but on more practical issues. But I hope that this would be useful. Thank you.
I've heard some of this before in a completely different context. And the context in which I've heard it, I think, some years ago, was in the discussion about the genetic modification of food crops. And I just want to throw this in. I mean, you may tell me this is completely irrelevant. Please do if it is. But is there a model there? Is there a precedent there? Are there any possible solutions there that might be useful in this discussion? And any of you up here with me? Richard?
I'm not an expert necessarily on GM crops, but as also an interested outsider, I observe is that discussion certainly hasn't ended yet, and that there are very different perceptions within, say, North America and Europe, for example, and certainly also within the developing countries who gets to benefit, who bears the risks, and so on. But what it does show is that the ethical considerations are extremely important, and to repeat myself, you can't leave those to natural scientists and engineers.
That's my point in a sense, because it seems to be one of the lessons from the GM debate was that the public were not engaged at an early enough stage, so that suddenly when, Monsanto burst upon the scene, everybody went, whoa, what's going on here? Jason?
Well, I would just add that was one of the 2 points I was going to make, is the fact that the thing we have learned from GM, and not just GM, but biotech more generally, nanotech, there are many of these sorts of examples where it was presented to the public after a point in time when the research, much of the research was already underway, and that created a sense of why weren't we consulted early enough. Particularly when you're dealing with geoengineering, which is international in scope. You're not talking about modifying a crop in your own nation state that might eventually blow across borders, and you're a little concerned about that. You're talking about technologies that are intentionally designed to moderate the global climate. So therefore, the actual intent is global. And that leads to questions of casus belli, it leads to the questions of how other countries will perceive it. And so that's the second point I would make, is there's a lot to learn about the public communication aspects of this and early engagement, but we should not lose sight of the fact that geoengineering is fundamentally different from other technologies we've talked about before, in that the intended scope, not the unintended scope, but the intended scope is global in nature, and therefore it really poses us a unique governance challenge in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that Jason just made. I just will add 2 brief reflections. One is the silver lining here might be, from a kind of deployment standpoint, I think geoengineering is probably an easier problem to address than GM crops or nanotech.